What's the way out for President Trump in a renewed Iran war escalation? If America is pulled deeper into another Middle East war, what options does President Trump really have? What will the video contain? Why the conflict is escalating again? What options does Trump have? Economy, politics, and global influence. Which path might be most realistic? What restarted the crisis? The renewed tensions between the United States and Iran did not emerge overnight. Instead, they are the result of years of mistrust, regional competition, and repeated military confrontations. Every new incident adds another layer to a conflict that has never been fully resolved. In recent months, attacks involving regional proxy groups, concerns over Iran's nuclear program, and military deployments across the Middle East have once again raised fears of a wider confrontation. For Washington, protecting American troops, allies, and vital shipping routes remains a top priority. Iran, on the other hand, argues that it is responding to external pressure and defending its regional interests. Both sides accuse each other of escalating the situation, making diplomacy increasingly difficult. One of the biggest concerns is the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which a significant share of the world's oil exports passes every day. Any disruption in this area could quickly push energy prices higher and affect economies far beyond the Middle East. That is why even limited military incidents in the region often receive global attention. The crisis has also drawn in regional powers and international allies, each with their own strategic interests. Countries across the Middle East are closely monitoring developments, knowing that a broader conflict could threaten regional stability, global trade, and international security. As tensions rise, world leaders continue to call for restraint while preparing for the possibility of further escalation. Military readiness has increased, but diplomatic channels remain active as governments attempt to prevent a larger war. Understanding how this crisis restarted is essential because it explains why the stakes are so. The decisions made in Washington, Tehran, and other regional capitals over the coming weeks could determine whether the situation moves toward diplomacy, limited military confrontation, or a much broader conflict with global consequences. Trump's biggest dilemma. For President Donald Trump, the renewed escalation with Iran presents one of the most difficult foreign policy challenges of his presidency. On one side, there is strong pressure to demonstrate American strength and protect U.S. forces, allies, and strategic interests across the Middle East. On the other, any major military response carries the risk of triggering a wider regional conflict with unpredictable consequences. Trump has long argued that the United States should avoid becoming trapped in prolonged overseas wars. That position resonates with many Americans, who are weary of costly military interventions after decades of conflict in the Middle East. However, a restrained response could also be criticized by political opponents and some national security experts as a sign of weakness if American personnel or interests are threatened. Another challenge is balancing military objectives with economic concerns. A broader conflict could disrupt global energy supplies, increase oil prices, and contribute to higher inflation. Such economic effects would not only impact American consumers, but could also influence financial markets and international trade. The international dimension further complicates the situation. U.S. allies may support efforts to deter aggression, but they could differ on how far military action should go. Some partners favor stronger diplomatic engagement to prevent escalation, while others emphasize maintaining credible military deterrence. Managing these different expectations requires careful coordination. At the same time, Trump must consider domestic political realities. Decisions made during an international crisis often shape public opinion and become central issues in national political debate. Every option, whether military action, economic pressure, or renewed diplomacy, comes with significant advantages as well as serious risks. Ultimately, Trump's biggest dilemma is finding a strategy that protects American interests, reassures allies, avoids an uncontrollable regional war, and preserves room for diplomacy. The choices made during periods of heightened tension can influence not only U.S.-Iran relations, but also the broader balance of power across the Middle East for years to come. Option 1. Military escalation. One possible path available to President Trump is a stronger military response aimed at deterring Iran and preventing further attacks on American forces or regional allies. Supporters of this approach argue that a decisive show of strength can discourage future aggression and reinforce U.S. credibility in the Middle East. Military options could range from precision strikes against selected targets to increased naval and air deployments designed to protect strategic locations and shipping routes. Advocates believe that a limited operation, carefully planned and narrowly focused, could send a clear message without triggering a full-scale war. They argue that demonstrating military capability may persuade Iran and its regional partners to reconsider actions that could threaten American interests. However, military escalation also carries significant risks. Even a limited strike could provoke retaliation against U.S. military bases, diplomatic facilities, commercial shipping, or allied countries in the region. Such responses could quickly expand the conflict beyond its original scope, making it much harder to control. Another concern is the possibility of disruption to global energy markets. The Middle East remains one of the world's most important oil-producing regions, and any escalation affecting major shipping routes could increase energy prices and create economic uncertainty worldwide. Financial markets often react quickly to geopolitical instability, amplifying the broader economic impact. Military action also involves long-term strategic considerations. History has shown that conflicts in the Middle East can become more complex than initially expected, drawing in additional regional actors and requiring sustained political and military commitments. What begins as a limited operation can evolve into a much larger challenge. For President Trump, choosing military escalation would therefore involve balancing immediate security objectives against the possibility of broader regional instability. While a strong military response may project determination and deterrence, it also increases the risk of unintended consequences. The ultimate question is whether the benefits of using force would outweigh the political, economic, and humanitarian costs of a wider conflict. Option 2. Maximum pressure. Instead of expanding military operations, President Trump could choose a strategy centered on maximum pressure, using economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and financial restrictions to weaken Iran's ability to project power. This approach was a defining feature of Trump's first administration, and remains one of the most discussed alternatives to direct military escalation. The core idea behind maximum pressure is straightforward: increase the economic cost for Iran while avoiding the immediate risks of a large-scale war. The United States can tighten sanctions on Iran's banking sector, energy exports, shipping networks, and companies accused of helping Tehran bypass existing restrictions. Washington could also work with allies to strengthen enforcement and limit Iran's access to international markets. Supporters argue that this strategy puts sustained pressure on the Iranian government, without placing thousands of American troops in combat. They believe economic hardship can reduce government revenues, limit funding for regional allies and proxy groups, and encourage Tehran to return to negotiations under more favorable conditions. However, critics question whether sanctions alone can achieve long-term strategic goals. Iran has spent years adapting to economic restrictions by expanding regional trade, developing alternative financial channels, and strengthening partnerships with countries willing to continue commercial relations. As a result, the impact of additional sanctions may be less dramatic than in previous years. There is also the humanitarian dimension. Broad economic sanctions can contribute to inflation. Washington could also work with allies to strengthen enforcement shortages of imported goods and increased hardship for ordinary civilians, even when exemptions exist for food and medicine. This has led to international debate over how to balance political pressure with humanitarian concerns. For President Trump, maximum pressure offers a middle path between diplomacy and military action. It demonstrates firmness while reducing the immediate risk of a wider regional war. Yet it also requires patience, international cooperation, and consistent enforcement to remain effective. Ultimately, the success of this strategy would depend on whether sustained economic and diplomatic pressure changes Iran's calculations, or simply deepens the long-standing confrontation without producing a lasting political solution. Option 3. Diplomacy. The third option available to President Trump is diplomacy, a strategy focused on reducing tensions through negotiations rather than military action or additional economic pressure. While diplomacy is often viewed as the least confrontational path, it can also be the most difficult to achieve after years of distrust between the United States and Iran. A diplomatic approach would likely involve direct or indirect talks, often with the assistance of neutral mediators or partner nations. The primary goals could include reducing the risk of military confrontation, protecting regional stability, addressing concerns over Iran's nuclear activities, and improving security for international shipping and U.S. allies in the Middle East. Supporters of diplomacy argue that history has shown military conflicts rarely produce lasting political solutions on their own. Negotiations, although slow and complex, may create opportunities for confidence-building measures, limited agreements, or broader discussions that reduce the chances of future escalation. Even temporary understandings can help prevent misunderstandings that might otherwise trigger a larger conflict. However, diplomacy also faces major obstacles. Years of sanctions, military incidents, and political disagreements have created deep mistrust between Washington and Tehran. Leaders on both sides may be reluctant to make concessions, fearing domestic political criticism or the perception of appearing weak. In addition, regional allies and international partners may have different priorities, making negotiations even more complicated. For President Trump, choosing diplomacy would require balancing strength with flexibility. Any negotiation would likely need to reassure American allies, while also offering Iran incentives to engage in meaningful dialogue. Reaching that balance is often one of the greatest challenges in international diplomacy. Ultimately, diplomacy does not guarantee success, nor does it eliminate every security concern. Yet it remains one of the few options that offers the possibility of reducing tensions without the immediate human and economic costs of a broader war. Whether negotiations can succeed depends on political will, mutual trust, and both sides' willingness to pursue compromise over confrontation. The economic cost. Beyond the military and political consequences, a renewed confrontation between the United States and Iran could carry significant economic costs for both the region and the global economy. Financial markets tend to react quickly to geopolitical uncertainty, and even the possibility of a wider conflict can influence energy prices, investor confidence, and international trade. One of the greatest concerns is the impact on global oil supplies. The Middle East remains a critical energy-producing region, and the nearby Strait of Hormuz serves as one of the world's most important shipping routes for crude oil and liquefied natural gas. Any disruption to commercial traffic, whether through military activity or heightened security concerns, could increase transportation costs and reduce market confidence, potentially leading to higher fuel prices. Rising energy costs often affect far more than gasoline prices. Businesses that rely on transportation, manufacturing, and logistics may face higher operating expenses, which can contribute to broader inflation. Consumers may experience increased costs for goods and services, while governments may face additional pressure to stabilize their economies during periods of market volatility. Financial markets also respond to uncertainty. Investors frequently seek safer assets during geopolitical crises, while stock markets may experience short-term volatility. Companies with significant international operations can face additional risks if trade routes become less reliable or regional instability disrupts supply chains. For the United States, prolonged tension could increase defense spending and require additional military resources to protect strategic interests and allies. Regional countries may also face reduced tourism, lower foreign investment, and slower economic growth if instability continues. At the same time, uncertainty affects global business confidence. Companies often delay investment decisions when future conditions become unpredictable, reducing economic momentum across multiple industries. Ultimately, the economic impact of renewed U.S.-Iran tensions would extend well beyond the Middle East. Even if direct military confrontation remains limited, uncertainty alone can influence global markets, energy prices, inflation, and investment decisions. This is why many governments and international organizations continue to emphasize de-escalation and stability as essential components of long-term economic security. Political consequences. A renewed escalation between the United States and Iran would not only reshape the security landscape of the Middle East, it could also have major political consequences at home and abroad. Every decision made during an international crisis is closely watched by lawmakers, allies, rivals, and voters, making political calculations just as important as military strategy. For President Trump, managing the crisis would involve balancing national security with domestic political expectations. A strong response might be welcomed by supporters, who believe the United States should firmly defend its interests and allies. At the same time, a prolonged conflict could raise concerns among Americans, who prefer to avoid another costly military engagement overseas. Public opinion often shifts as events unfold, especially if economic costs or casualties increase. Congress could also play a significant role. Members of both major political parties may debate the scope of presidential authority, military funding, and the long-term objectives of U.S. involvement. Questions about strategy, oversight, and accountability often become central topics during periods of international tension. Internationally, America's allies would closely evaluate Washington's decisions. Some governments might support stronger deterrence measures, while others could emphasize diplomacy and de-escalation. Maintaining unity among allies is often essential because coordinated political and economic actions generally have greater international influence than unilateral decisions. The crisis could also affect America's global reputation. Supporters may argue that decisive leadership strengthens deterrence and reassures partners. Critics, however, may question whether military escalation increases instability or reduces opportunities for diplomatic solutions. These differing perspectives can influence future international cooperation and strategic partnerships. Ultimately, the political consequences of renewed U.S.-Iran tensions would extend far beyond the battlefield. The choices made during the crisis could shape public opinion, influence relationships with allies, affect congressional debates, and define America's broader foreign policy direction. For President Trump, success would depend not only on managing immediate security challenges, but also on maintaining political support at home while preserving international credibility abroad. Conclusion: as we've explored throughout this video, President Trump faces no easy path if tensions with Iran continue to rise. Each available strategy, military action, maximum economic pressure, or diplomacy, offers potential advantages but also carries significant risks. The challenge is not simply choosing one option over another, but finding a balance between protecting American interests, maintaining regional stability, and avoiding unintended consequences. A stronger military response could reinforce deterrence and demonstrate American resolve, but it also increases the possibility of a broader regional conflict that could draw in additional countries and create long-term security challenges. Maximum pressure through sanctions may weaken Iran's economy and limit its resources, yet history suggests that economic measures alone do not always produce lasting political solutions. Diplomacy, while often the least costly, in terms of lives and resources, requires trust, patience, and compromise, qualities that have been difficult to achieve after years of confrontation. Beyond the immediate decisions, the consequences of this crisis extend far beyond Washington and Tehran. Energy markets, global trade, financial stability, and international alliances could all be affected by the direction this conflict takes. Even a limited escalation has the potential to influence economies and security policies around the world. Ultimately, the future of U.S.-Iran relations will depend on decisions made by leaders on both sides, as well as the actions of regional allies and the broader international community. Whether the coming months lead to renewed negotiations, continued economic pressure, or further military confrontation remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that every decision carries consequences that could shape the Middle East and global politics for years to come. As always, the goal is to understand the facts, examine the different perspectives, and follow developments carefully rather than jumping to conclusions. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis helpful, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe diplomacy can still prevent a wider conflict, or has the region entered a new era of confrontation?